Texas!
Okay, well, thanks very much for coming, Joshua.
Hey, my pleasure.
We're fortunate today to have a real expert in Chinese political warfare with us, Joshua Phillip, investigative reporter with Epoch Times. Now, we hear a lot these days, Joshua, about the Chinese military threat. You know, more ships, more aircraft carriers and jets, and that sort of thing. But often overlooked, actually, is the other prong of Chinese warfare, and that's political warfare, influence operations, and you know all about it. It seems to me that the Chinese have been wildly successful buying off elites, political leaders, etc., around the world. How bad is it?
It's bad enough to where the Chinese Communist Party has dominated a large portion of the world almost totally through non-military means. And when I say dominated, I should make this clear. The Chinese Communist Party looks at warfare differently than a lot of us do. And it's a very simple thought process, which is, what would you want to get if you conquered another country? What do you get? You get political influence, you control their politics, you get control of their economy, you get control of their culture or media. The Chinese Communist Party has programs for this: political warfare, business warfare to control the businesses, economic warfare, control the GDP. When they talk about taking factories, who controls the means of production? Right? Who controls the world's factories? Who controls the world's means of production? Chinese Communist Party. And they go and export these programs at the One Belt, One Road initiative, where they get countries into debt traps, where they're having to pay back the CCP, and the CCP, of course, owns the things that it even built in that country. It owns their critical infrastructure, begins influencing their politicians through their own networks. The CCP, through non-military means, has really dominated most of the world by this point. And that's roughly the scale, I'd say.
So even the U.S.?
Even the U.S. Even the U.S. to a shocking extent. And think about it. So Dr. Di Dongsheng talked about this, one of members of Xi Jinping's brain trust. He said they control U.S. politics through Wall Street. And you see it. Now, with the Chinese Communist Party, when they were reeling from the virus and the economic shutdowns, what do? They say, we're opening back up, we're going to rebuild, invest in China. And Wall Street poured money into the Chinese Communist Party, poured money into it. And now the CCP, what else do? In the U.S., they influence politicians. Now, let me step back. The main program they use for this is something they do everywhere. Everywhere. This is the United Front Work Department. This is basically a branch of the Chinese Communist Party. They work through the Chinese consulates, and the Chinese consulates work as basically like local official, essentially provinces of China in foreign countries. They reach out to the Tongs, which are fraternal Chinese organizations. Not all of them are bad, but once it gains control of them, it gains control of those entire networks of influence. Tens of thousands of members, hundreds of thousands of members, student Tongs, oil worker Tongs, police Tongs, you name it. Every industry has a Tong. And these influential people within the Tongs go and interface with the rest of society. Business leaders, politicians, police, etc., academics, everything. They invite them on trips back to China. These people oftentimes leave either with just a better view of China because they've been propagandized by them, or they may be compromised through something like a honey trap, or compromised by something like they or their family members, for example, might have gotten a business deal with China. This is so common that I think if people saw the scale of it, they would be shocked. Even in the United States, almost every single major news outlet prints copies, inserts of one of the Chinese Communist Party's state-run media. They take money from the Chinese Communist Party and print their propaganda on American soil. Most politicians, not all of them, but I'd say a lot of them, have taken these trips to China. And the CCP lobbies not just heads, large, high-level politicians, but even local level, like community politicians and so on. It could be your local city council member getting lobbied by the CCP to take a trip to China. How many academics were found to be working and taking undisclosed gifts gifts from Chinese sources? A lot of them. How many think tanks work with China? These guys write our policies. How many different businesses work with China? It came out in the US. There was even a Republican report that showed many businesses, most of these big corporations, even have board members who are Chinese Communist Party members. How many Hollywood films have involvement or even direct participation in the writing of their scripts and production by Chinese Communist Party sources? They control our entertainment, they control our media, they influence our politicians, they control our businesses. Who controls the systems of governance that define what a country is? And this is America. It's even more so in the Asian region, extremely more so in Latin America and in Africa. And the CCP does this everywhere. Same model, same system, same practices. Some places it's more overt, more obvious, some places less so.
In South Korea, these days, the Moon Jae-in administration, by their own words and their past history, seems to be pro-China, pro-North Korea, basically anti-American. At least within the administration, is certainly a core radical group like that. And how would they fit into a Chinese influence operation?
Well, of course, any near China country is going to be a huge target. Some countries, they're more aggressive, and Korea should be aware of this. Korea is a prosperous country. It's actually very Americanized, right? In terms of Western influences, it's really one of the more prosperous Asian countries. I mean, first world country, fantastic place. It's an anomaly within that region because it aligned with the Western world for so long. But the alternative to that, the China system, is at their doorstep. They can look across the border, they can see what North Korea is like. They can look to other parts of the Asia-Pacific region. They can look to like Vietnam, for example, and see what happened there. Where the CCP, even though they're anti-China in a lot of ways, you have the Chinese triads who will kill people like nothing. They're more overt there, they're more daring there. If you speak out against them, they don't have a problem killing you, right? They don't have problems with these things, and they will do that if your system allows it to. It's a sliding scale, and if you're gonna keep falling down, where you're gonna slowly lose the system you have. Now, Korea's in an interesting position. They're a first world country. They're a fantastic country. They have huge influence politically, really respected internationally. In the US, every person I know watches K-dramas and listens to K-pop and so on. Everyone loves them. But that's only because they have free market capitalism. But that's taken away, they lose that. And they have a choice right now. Do they align with the free world, or do they align with the Chinese system? And if they align with that, that's North Korea, that's the Chinese Communist Party, that's Iran, that's Russia, and their whole system. They have the other option, which is aligned with Japan, India, Japan, India, Australia, the United States. Maybe not Japan, I don't like them very much. But at the very least, join this US-led system opposing the CCP. And they can continue really having that, I'd say, prosperity that they have, or lean the other way. And this is where I think Korea sits right now on this precipice.
Looking at it from, say, Beijing's perspective, what would be the attraction of subverting South Korean leadership and eventually South Korea?
Well, I'd say a few different things to this. One is they work very closely with North Korea. And the image of South Korea is just kind of like what Taiwan is to mainland China. You know, Taiwan is the example of what China could be. South Korea is the example of what Korea could be, North Korea could be. And people can look across the strait and see, oh, maybe this totalitarian communist system creates worse societies because this is the same people and the same culture. We could be like that. That is a danger to them every single moment, because people can look to the free world and see what they're missing out on. And they can see that, oh, they're just like me, but they have freedom, they have prosperity, and they're able to have harmonious societies and governance and rule of law like we don't have. And maybe this communist system we have doesn't work. When it comes to politicians, though, the interest is different because you can get a whole lot of money from working with the CCP. Any dream you have can be served to you, basically. Anything you want, the CCP can give it to you if you're a politician and you want to sell out your country to the Communist Party.
It's also been very interesting how the Chinese political warfare effort has targeted academic institutions worldwide, but certainly in the United States and South Korea as well. Can you tell us something about how that works.
So, adopted in the Chinese military code is the three warfares doctrine. This is psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare. Psychological warfare isn't necessarily lying to you. Psychological warfare is changing the conclusion you come to when observing a set of information. It's changing the narrative. So if you look at the CCP taking over the South China Sea, do you see it as a communist country conquering land, right? Conquering, building up land and conquering, areas and denying access to others? Or do you view it as the CCP just, demonstrating its free ability to go and build and engage in these things and do what it wants? Do you see it as historical ownership, which is their narrative? Or do you see it as them as a conquering hostile nation? That is psychological warfare. When the CCP goes and does debt traps throughout Latin America and throughout Africa and a lot of Asia with these One Belt, One Road initiative projects, and they're buying off politicians, bribing them, doing castle diplomacy, they're building mansions for these people and getting them to sell out their countries, sell out their freedoms to the Communist Party of China on things that will put their own people into debt for the foreseeable future and give some of their critical infrastructure to the Chinese Communist Party. Do you view it as that? Or do you view it as an economic opportunity of the Chinese Communist Party spreading its, wealth around the world? This is psychological warfare. Media warfare is controlling the outlets of information. Legal warfare is lawfare, manipulating courts. But media warfare is what this is part of. You gain control of the voices of influence in different countries. Gain control of the media, gain control of the journalists, gain control of the movie stars, the actors, the musicians. You gain control of those voices and have them very subtly present the narratives, the psychological warfare narratives of the Chinese Communist Party. Eventually, they will start seeing things and interpreting things through the lens of Chinese Communist Party propaganda and begin leaning more towards the goals that they presented with that. And so it is huge. They do this aggressively. In the US, it's very, very far along. And in most of the countries, it's even further along.
Yeah, I've noticed the Confucius Institute, so the center of this effort against academia.
Oh, yeah.
And the US hasn't, Korea hasn't, they're all over. Another aspect I'd like to cover is the fentanyl. I wouldn't call it a crisis, I would simply call it the attack, the assault we're under. Tell us something about that, please.
Yeah, so I've done several investigative pieces on Chinese drug warfare. So there's a great book, it's called Red Cocaine by Joseph Douglas. And it talks about how in the early days of the CCP's takeover of China, how Mao Zedong talked about people's opium and wanted to use opium to wage war against the West, just like the British did against China during the Opium Wars. And the idea was you can destroy a country's youth. You can destroy the moral fabric of a society. You can damage them. You can cause internal instability. You can kill their children. You can kill the children of a country using this while making a profit and while also gaining control of the criminal underworld. Any system like this will control the legitimate society and the illegitimate society. You're dealing with there's multi-trillion-dollar businesses in the legitimate society. There's multi-trillion-dollar businesses in the illegitimate society. And there's a whole lot of people who work in that as well. The Chinese Communist Party wants to control both. And so when it comes to this, that's not only fentanyl, not only these synthetic drugs that they're exporting, and of course you can buy them online because they can get around the technical definitions of what is an illegal controlled substance by just changing, one molecule and so on. It's very easy to do. But they also supply the precursor chemicals for drugs like methamphetamine. They also supply the drug cartels in Latin America with firearms through Norinco. They also control a lot of these organizations through their cooperation with Iran, which has a lot of influence in Latin America, and other programs like this. And so a lot of this drug war against the US is being done heavily with Chinese Communist Party influence. And yes, this happens in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah. With the fentanyl, just for the listeners who may not know, they know the drug problem, but they may not know that almost all of the drugs ultimately come from the United States, and that it's been killing for about the last 6-7 years about 50,000 Americans a year. And these are Americans of all backgrounds. A lot of them are of what would be called military age, and it's really doing the equivalent of taking a division or two of American servicemen off the battlefield.
Yeah, well, how many soldiers did America lose in the Vietnam War? 70,000 killed, something like that?
Yeah, I think the height of the Vietnam War wasn't this bad.
Yes.
So it's part of the sort of psychological ultimately against the United States. What do we do about it? Not say for the United States, but also say other countries, South Korea, etc. If they can even understand the problem, what do you think are the most effective countermeasures?
The most effective countermeasures is you don't give an inch. And when it comes to not just the Communist Party of China, but communism in general, you don't give an inch. Because that's how they work. They will say, this is the way the communist dialectic works. Dialectical materialism, right? You identify an issue, you invert it, and you eliminate the middle. You create the opposite and use the opposite to agitate the incumbent system you're trying to destroy. If you want to destroy the family structure, you promote divorce. If you want to destroy the family structure, you promote, let's say, laws that can take away kids from families. You promote things that destroy the moral fabric of society. If you want to, get rid of the youth and so on, you promote drugs. You want to promote things that damage the cultural and moral fabric, right? They always want you to acknowledge a little bit of what they do. And this goes back to even what happened in, Korean War with the United States, American POWs who were captured, and the way the CCP brainwashed them. They don't ask you to acknowledge, the grand, North Korean regime. They ask you to first acknowledge that your country is not as great as you think it is. To acknowledge some of their policies. Do you agree that this policy of America is evil? Oh, yes, I disagree with that. What about this one? Oh, yes, I disagree with that. Oh, what about this one and this one and this one? And they can subtly present you with alternative narratives that make you gradually hate your country. And when you hate your country, they can gradually serve you another opinion, another alternative. That is the slow drive, the communist dialectic that drives you step by step by step towards a system they want to create. And I'd say the only solution to that is you don't give an inch.
How is it best exposed? It seems like that's an essential part of it, is to make people aware of what the problem is. What's your observation on that?
Well, let's be clear on this. There's a reason why every single communist country needs to control the media. There's a reason why every single communist country needs to monitor the actions and opinions of every single citizen of the country. It's because it's a psychological war. And when you're fighting a culture war and a psychological war, the biggest, let's say, weakness to the system is ideology. The actions of many of these countries cannot withstand the light of day, and they know this, which is why they censored, which is why they have the Great Firewall of China, which is why they have the three warfares doctrine we just talked about, which is why that many people in China still think that the Tiananmen Square massacre never happened, that the students just went home. They need to control information because what they do cannot withstand the light of day. And the way you fight back against that is by exposing every single thing they do.
Essential. And just speaking of South Korea, as many of our listeners are from there, with the Moon administration's the statements they've made, them very pro-Chinese, fawning towards the Chinese Communist Party, signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative, encouraged Chinese investment into South Korea, encouraged the building of what are effectively Chinatowns all over the country. That it is so welcoming in Chinese immigrants. That these are all part of what you just described. And it is something that needs to be exposed, as you said, but also never given in. I think the Australians have done a pretty good job of waking up to this.
The Australians were pretty far along and they woke up to it. But let's be clear. These leaders know where these policies lead to. They've watched it happen in other countries. Many parts, Sri Lanka, for example, got involved with the One Belt, One Road Initiative. You had politicians there saying, we're going to wake up one day and find ourselves a vassal state of China. And that has happened in many parts of Latin America. It's happened in many countries in Africa. It's happening in parts of Asia. I think that South Korea right now, I think what they're dealing with is they think they can drink poison and not die from it. They know that it's poison. They've seen what it does to other countries. They know what the results are going to be from doing it, but they're drinking it. And they're thinking it's not going to happen to them.
Yeah, that's human nature. It's always wrong. One last question, is you've demonstrated nicely that the Chinese assault on people's thinking, on their education system, their economy. What about the assault on their financial system?
Yeah.
The States, the U.S. dollar. it's really the last big club that we have to wield against the CCP. You see that as also being under attack.
Yes, the Chinese Communist Party is waging financial warfare against the United States. I won't go into the whole picture of this. There's a great book and movie on this called Death by China by Peter Navarro.
Oh, yeah.
Highly recommend. But I'll talk about what they're doing right now, which is this new digital currency. If this is not stopped, let me tell you what the future is going to be. The Chinese Communist Party is creating a new system of currency, the new digital currency. This is not like cryptocurrency where it hides your identity. This is a currency tied to your social credit score, tied to your citizenship score, whether managed by the government or by private companies like is happening in the US right now. They're talking about it. This means that the Chinese Communist Party or whatever country does this, and the CCP is trying to export it. They're creating a standard globally that centralized banks and the Federal Reserve in the US are looking into, and many countries are talking about. They're talking about the digital dollar, the digital euro, the digital pound. They're talking about this already. In China right now, this is in practice. It means that the Chinese Communist Party can approve or deny every single transaction. And if your citizen score isn't high enough, well, maybe your daily bread is denied to you.
I'm joking, but this has been enlightening, and I think the listeners will find it just informative, but also it's a good warning.
Well, and one more part on that. What happens also if the Chinese Communist Party's currency becomes an international trading currency? U.S. sanctions are done.
That is really the last thing we have. Our military advantage is waning, and it's hard to see what else we have. And it is that the dollar is the thing, and you can see it under attack. And as you say, if the Chinese currency does become accepted, we're in trouble at that point.
It means the system of international peace falls apart. It means that the only other option, because you lose sanctions, the only other option is war. And what countries would still be capable of fighting against the Chinese Communist Party at that point? Unless the people take this seriously, this is the future.
Well, it's a grim warning, but I appreciate you taking the time to come and explain this to us and let us take advantage of your many years' experience. It's nice to meet you, and thank you for coming.
Hey, pleasure. Thank you as well.